Welcome to the virtual tour in the days of Achashverosh, a special virtual tour and virtual journey following the footsteps of the Book of Esther in honor of the holiday of Purim. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that there are multiple tours planned underway and virtual tours, public tours in real time that are going to be posted on my website. So if you enjoy this tour, please make sure to come back for more. And of course, find me on multiple platforms. There is YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Haps app. We have a nice growing community called Museums Fun and Learning, and a lot of exciting stuff are hopefully going to be happening soon. Let's jump right into it. Welcome to the Persian Empire, the largest empire in the history of the ancient Near East. This empire spanned a tremendous large landmass, and this is the story of Purim. This is where it happens. And it all began in the city of Shushan. But before we jump into the city of Shushan, since a picture is worth 1,000 words, let me show you the Persian Empire. Look how massive. Now, the verses of the Megillah, of the story of Purim, open up by telling us that it was in the days of Achashverosh, who ruled from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. So let's see it. Here is the landmass. Let's zoom in. This entire landmass covered what was previously the largest empire in the world, which is Babylon, and also Assyria, and this is by far much larger. So this is an incredible landmass, and our story focuses around the capital city of Shushan. Let's see where it is. These two dots, the two red dots, represent the two capitals of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire actually had two different capital cities, and one of them is the center of operation in the story of Purim, but the truth is that there were two of them, and from history and archaeology, we don't really have a conclusive answer as to why they operated with two capitals and how exactly they worked. But our suggestion is that the capital in Shushan, which was a very, very ancient city called Shush, and we're going to visit that city soon, is the place which was operated during the winter, because in the summer, Shushan was probably way too hot to live in. And so in the summer, they would move down to Persepolis, which is further away to the east, to the southeast, as you can see over here. Our story takes place in Shushan, and therefore we're assuming that that's the capital because of the words Shushan Habira, which we generally translate as Shushan the capital, but as we're going to see soon, that's not exactly the case. Now, I want to just give you an overview before we go into this place, before we dive in. There are several spots over here that we're going to be visiting, and so I'm going to mention them now before we jump in so you know where they are. So first of all, Persepolis, and then this blue marker over here is Naksh Rostam or Behistun. We're going to see that later. You can ignore the yellow one. That's the tomb of Cyrus the Great. We're going to mention Cyrus the Great, but we don't have to go to his tomb. The best place to begin this tale is actually not in the museum and not in the capitals either. The best place to begin this is in the National Museum of Iran. And the National Museum of Iran is in Tehran. So what better place to begin when we are here behind our computers, unable to travel, definitely not able to travel to Iran right now. So let's go in and actually see the Museum of Iran. Welcome to Tehran. Look at the museum right there, sitting and waiting for us to jump in. Let's jump into the museum, shall we? Wow, we are in front of a wall. How exciting. This wall is actually important to us, but before we look at the wall, let's look at this picture and see what was discovered in the ground. This statue, discovered inside the ground, is standing right behind us, and we're going to see that statue in just a moment. But look where the statue was found. It was found at the entrance to this complex, which is the city gate or the palace gate, known in the Megillah as Sha'ar HaMelech, the gate of the king. So now that you know that where that statue was standing, let's actually see the statue I'm talking about. Boom. Now let's get a better view of the statue so we can see what's going on. Ladies and gentlemen, standing almost 2 meters tall is the only standing statue of the Persian Empire ever found, even though the assumption is there may have been two, one on each side of the entrance of the royal gate. But this is a statue of King Darius the Great, Dariyavush. We're going to talk a lot about Darius. How is Darius relevant to our story? I'll give you the short version right now because we're going to have plenty of time to talk about Darius later. Darius was successful in usurping the throne after the son of Cyrus the Great. He was able to capture the throne, consolidate the empire, and one of the things which he did was establish the capital of the Persian Empire in Shushan, and he also built one in Persepolis, even though there was nothing ever built in that city before. This is not unusual in the ancient Near East. Kings would ascend to the throne, and then they would just make their new capital city. We find this, for example, with Sancherib, who moves the capital to Nineveh. This is a common thing. Now let's look at the statue. The more astute of you might notice that this statue looks somewhat suspiciously Egyptian, and that is because it was made in Egypt, and it looks Egyptian, and it actually has hieroglyphics on it. Now, this is a statue of a Persian king, and so while he's standing like Pharaoh with his left foot forward and his hand clasping perhaps a lotus or something like that, but he was definitely Persian, and you see that on the way he dresses, which is completely different than Egyptian, and he also lost his head, so we can't really know what his face looked like, but we can guess based on the artifacts we're going to see soon. But let's examine this statue a little bit closer to see what is the story that Darius is telling us. So, hieroglyphics and images of deities of Egypt tying together in a knot, perhaps tying together Upper and Lower Egypt. If you look carefully at the folds of his gown, you'll see that there's hieroglyphics on one side and cuneiform on the other. He was writing in two languages here, and he was also writing things which make him look good in the eyes of the Egyptians, like the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt and the beloved of the sun god Amun, etc. Look below his feet. Can you see that there are images of people kneeling and their hands lifted up in praise, and they're standing on top of this circle which is filled with hieroglyphics? Generally, we call it a cartouche, but the cartouche, that circle which has hieroglyphics in it, usually refers to the name of the king. And here what Darius, what the Persians did with this, is refer to names of provinces or names of satrapies, which is a district. It's an administrative division of the empire. Now, if the Megillah tells us that the kingdom ruled over 127 provinces, which were then divided into satrapies, etc., and then the statue of the king shows you all of these nations tiny, kneeling beneath the feet of the king. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, a statue is worth 1,000,000 words. This is showing you how everyone is beneath him. And now let's go back to that wall that we were looking at when we jumped into the museum. Here's the close-up, and you see that each one represents a different person. They're slightly different in their dress, in their facial features, in their headdress, and it says from left to right, there's Persia, Media, Elam, Arya, Parthia, Bactria, Sogdia, and so on and so forth. Oh, this picture is a reconstruction, an artistic reconstruction of the palace in Shushan. We're going to see that picture later. So at the foot of the statue is a map. Now this map is beautifully done. I'm going to show this to you up close so you can see it now on the slide. And this map really shows you how the Persian Empire spanned across a tremendously large landmass. And here is where I would like to quote to you the words of Darius himself from an inscription found at the foundation of his palace at Persepolis. And he writes as follows: "Says Darius the king, this is the kingdom which I hold, from the Scythians who are beyond Sogdiana, thence unto Ethiopia, and from Sind, thence unto Sardis." And I've highlighted those different areas so that you can see it. But if you want to appreciate the breadth, the span of the Persian Empire and their incredible and absolute control, this map shows you where all of those nations which are gathered beneath the feet of the king are spread out on the map, and you really can drive that point home. How powerful an image. Now you're looking at a map of the Persian Empire, and we're going to get to that map towards the end. I want to show you three more things here in the museum in Tehran. So first of all, the palace guard. The palace guard, the royal guard, was found in the palace in Shushan, and it's a beautiful glazed clay brick. in full color, and it probably represents the 10,000 immortals of the king of Persia, which, if you've seen the movie 300 and the Battle of Thermopylae, the immortals are mentioned there, except that Leonidas' soldiers make mincemeat out of them. But this is a more accurate description of what they looked like. Beautiful embroidery, colorful, very nice. I'm going to jump ahead now to another relief found at the treasury of Persepolis. Behold, the king sitting on his throne. Now, this relief, which means a 3D carving into the wall, was found in the treasury house in Persepolis, and it most likely depicts King Xerxes, who we are going to assume in this tour is Achashverosh, and perhaps later we'll talk a little bit about how that connection was made. But this is the king, so we're going to say Achashverosh, sitting on his throne. You see that his legs are supported by a footstool. He's holding a lotus in his left hand, and he has a long scepter in his right hand. And behind him is the heir to the throne, presumably Artaxerxes or Artaxasta, who we know as his son. So this image really helps us picture the way we would envision the story of Achashverosh sitting there in the throne room and Queen Esther approaching him, waiting to get an audience with him and to plead for the Jewish people. And then he lifts up his scepter, his sharvit, points it to her, and then she comes over and she touches the head of the scepter. If you want to envision what that looked like, all you got to do is imagine the colors that this relief was in, assuming that this is what Achashverosh looked like. And this is it. Isn't that incredible? You see the soldiers there, and you see a person timidly standing before the king and saying, "Well, sire, it appears that might be a great idea. Of course, of course." Yes, my British accent isn't so good, but I try. Let's jump to the other end of the hall. 1, 2, 3, and boom. Houston, we have landed. You're looking at the main stairway going up to the throne room. Imagine going up the stairs to go and see the king as you come into the palace. Now, the story of Purim opens up telling us about this lavish banquet, which was a very, very long banquet. It took 180 days. And people from all across the empire are coming to see the king, to participate in this party, and to bring tribute. So let's look at some things that are going on here, because if we were to go back in time, this is what we're going to be seeing. So let's look at it closely. Behind us in this frame is an inscription. An inscription usually is used to dedicate who built the building and to give them honor. So this one is probably dedicated to Darius and talking about how Xerxes, his son, continued building the palace. But this is not so uncommon today. I mean, you can't walk into a school building or a government building or a museum or a gallery without seeing the name of the donor listed there on a plaque or on the name, right? Because that's what people would do. They'd make donations in order that their name be remembered. So let's look up close at the stairs, and I want to show you something really cool. Can you see that there are people climbing up the stairs? It's all right if they're too small to see, because we're going to see more of this in large and life size or in near life size when we go to Persepolis. There are images of people here representing all of these different nations climbing up the stairs and bringing tribute to the king. Now, this is part of the policy which was instituted by Darius, which enabled him to collect taxes efficiently, to collect tribute efficiently from the far corners of the empire. And not only was he successful in actually collecting and raising taxes, but he was also successful in decorating his palace everywhere with that message, so everybody can appreciate the grandeur of this empire and see how everyone throughout the empire is gathering taxes and bringing them to the king. So if the statue tells you that story, and then the staircase tells you the story, and the walls tell you that story, that is called propaganda. And Darius the Great was an expert in royal propaganda, in showing you who's boss. To the left of the staircase is an image of the king wrestling a lion, and that is not uncommon in the ancient Near East. The Assyrians, for example, used to battle lions for sport, and this is no exception. You would want to show yourself as the ruler of all, and so if the lion is the king of the animal kingdom, then the king of the human kingdom, who wants to be beyond that, is going to show himself wrestling the lion. And finally, to the right is a funky statue, which the more astute we'll notice is very similar to Assyrian royal statues, and that's because the Persians actually copied a lot of stuff from the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and much more than that in order to create this new royal architecture, which gives you a sense of power wherever you come from. If you're used to seeing power represented as a striding statue with everyone beneath you in Egypt, then he does that. If you want to see him looking like a divine creature, which is a combination of bull and eagle and lion, he'll do that too. Whatever speaks to you, the Persians were innovative and they were able to create this language which really projected power. One last stop before we move on. We're going to turn around. Let's move up towards those bulls. I just have one question. Who let the dogs out? Now get a look at these bulls. We're going to get to some bulls later. These bulls are actually the capitals of a pillar, of a column, which stood 20 meters high. And you're going to see for yourself how we know that. Now, this pillar supported the beams of the ceiling of the palaces, of the banquet halls from the palaces in the Persian kingdom, most notably Persepolis. And we're going to see that for ourselves. So now that we've seen that, we're going to take our car and we're going to park it right by the map. So 3, 2, 1, ready for warp. And boom, here we are looking at the map. And we're going to get back to this map a little bit later. Our next stop is the Palace of Shushan. We are now going to the capital of the Persian Empire, where our story takes place, in Shushan Habira. I want you to take a look at the environment and see just how much field area is there. This is a very agricultural area. I wonder what they grow there. Let's move in. I'm going to give you a second to read the labels. I want you to see that there's a few different important sites going on here. There's the Tomb of Daniel right there. You see I've highlighted it. There's a place called Shush Castle, and then there's Apadhana Castle Shush, and then it just says Susa, and the overall name for this place in red is called Shush, which is the ancient name of the city. The city is over 4,000 years old. It's really been there for a while, so perhaps that's why the party was happening there. We don't really know for sure. Now, I just want to say that I'm not going to be talking about the Tomb of Daniel, and the Shush Castle has nothing to do with our story. The only connection the Shush Castle has to our story is that over 100 years ago, a French expedition to Susa, excavating the palace, built a palace there so that they can excavate, because you're not going to excavate if you're French without having the proper European-style accoutrements around you. And so it's important to excavate in style. If you've seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you'll see how the French archaeologist dresses over there in the middle of the desert. You have to have class. Now, remember how I said that the word Bira, Shushan HaBira, doesn't actually mean the capital? And therefore, the misnomer of Shushan HaBira being the capital is coming from the modern usage of the word Bira. The truth is that Bira doesn't mean capital. Bira, which actually comes from the old Akkadian Birtu, means fortress, and you are looking at a fortress. If you look carefully, you'll realize that from the point where it says Susa here, there is a dark crevice in the land that is actually a moat, which the Shaur River would fill up, and this hilltop was surrounded by a glacis, which means diagonal man-made structure which prevents people from climbing up, and then there is the fortress. And here is the fortress. This is where the story of Purim is happening. Now, we know an incredible amount about this palace, and I want to show this to you through the image which we saw in the museum. So I'm going to show you that image first, and then we're going to jump back to Shushan, because that way we'll be able to appreciate what we're looking at. So the image that you're looking at right now is that French artistic reconstruction of the palace in Shushan, and starting on the left and moving clockwise, we're starting with the gate of the king, the royal gate, the palace gate, which was, by the way, discovered a little bit later after the palace. So this is where the statue of Darius was found, okay? That's where Mordechai sits and eavesdrops Bigtana and Teresh, who are scheming to assassinate the king. And that's where Mordechai sits in order to get word from Esther, who's in the palace, because he wants to know what's going on. Now, moving further in, there is this external courtyard, this larger courtyard, which is known as the outer courtyard. This is where Haman, comes to suggest to the king in the middle of the night how to get rid of Mordechai and to hang him on a high tree. Okay? And moving in, there is the more elevated, kind of like a darker ceiling. That's the king's residence, where the king would be sitting on his throne. And there is an outer courtyard right there where he probably would sit to accept an audience, maybe. And that's where we hear Esther coming in to approach and waiting to be shown the scepter to go in instead of being shot by the guards. And behind him is the harem, which is known as the Bet Hanashim, and there's also the treasury there, where we found a lot of treasure and cool stuff. So we're going to see all that later. Now moving to the far right corner, I want to show you that there is a structure with 4 towers around it, which is called the Apadhana Castle. Now the Apadhana is the banquet hall. That's where the party took place, and it was over 100 meters long. And so if you want to envision where they put everyone in a party, this is where the party took place. Now, how long was the party? Remember? 180 days. Yamim rabim shmonim u'me'at yom. That's half a year. That's an incredible long time for a party. I mean, imagine just the cleaners and the hard work that the cleaners had to do to just clean the place after every day of the party, right? So that's incredible. Now, I want to show you another really cool part. So here I'm going to switch to a slide which shows you sort of the floor plan and from a slightly different angle. So I hope you're not getting too dizzy. And you are seeing the garden. So this Apadhana was open to a garden, and the Persian word for garden is trickled down into the Hebrew and into the English language, because that is the word pardes. Pardes means garden. The Garden of Eden, paradise, actually paradise means garden. And the word pardes also shows up in Song of Songs, in Shir HaShirim, Shelachayich pardes rimonim. It shows up in Kohelet and Ecclesiastes, Asiti li ganotu pardesim. So the word is trickled into Hebrew, which is really, really cool. Okay, so this is our palace. Now, the next image I'm showing you is just a bit of a teaser, because after Shushan, I'm going to show you Persepolis. And this is an image of some of the staircases and the gardens in Persepolis, which is very similar to the palace in Shushan, but it's a beautiful image with a lot of color. And if you look carefully on the right, you'll see that there's an image of a bull. And remember I said you're going to be seeing bulls in the future? You're going to be seeing a lot more bulls where this comes from, with some really fun surprises soon. Okay, now let's go back to the palace. So welcome back to the actual site of Shushan. The site of Shushan, the floor plan was preserved pretty well, but the actual... The structure itself didn't survive so well. But lucky for us, remember that there was a sister capital city, and that's where you can really, really get a glimpse of what it looked like. Welcome to Persepolis. We've jumped really, really far distance, but we're at warp speed over here. And you're looking from afar at the entire layout of the palace in Persepolis. It looks kind of similar. It's a little bit larger, but there are some similarities. And I want you to just look into the distance and see just how far you can see these pillars. Look. Those pillars are standing, guess how tall? That's right, 20 meters tall. Pillars that are standing 20 meters tall with those bull-shaped capitals on top of them, and they are still standing 2,300 years after Alexander the Great came into the city, burning it and destroying it. How incredible is that? Now we're going to jump into the palace. Before we do, I want to give you the bird's eye view. Here's the bird's eye view, and just highlight a couple things that we're going to be looking at. Notice that on the bottom left here is the Gate of All Nations. And then there is the tomb of Artaxerxes III in the background. That's where we were standing to look at the structure. And there's also an Apadhana Palace. Now, this city was built on top of a plain platform. There was nothing here before. It was built by Darius, and his son Xerxes built on top of it, and the following successors also built more onto it. So this was extensively built. But Xerxes, Achashverosh, added 2 elements to this, and I want to show them to you. The first one is called the Gate of All Nations. And the Gate of All Nations is our next stop in here. And then he also built the Hall of 100 Pillars. The Hall of 100 Pillars is a hall that, if you guessed correctly, has 100 pillars. Archaeologists are just great at naming these things, aren't they? So this is the Hall of 100 Pillars, and here is the Gate of All Nations. And we're going to be jumping around just a little bit so that we can grasp the the size of the palace, appreciate it, and sort of imagine we were there during the time of the banquet. Let's go to the Gate of All Nations. We have just jumped to the top of two very high staircases, which is about 2 stories high, coming from the bus stop down below. And now that bus stop is, of course, courtesy of the Iranian Transportation Ministry, but that's not our point. Our point is actually what's behind us. We are now standing right in front of the Gate of All Nations, built by Achashverosh, our king, our villain, hero, or anti-hero of the story. Before we jump in, I want to surprise you. I want to take you somewhere you were not expecting, because the head of these massive bulls are missing, but one of them was preserved and actually is in a museum in the world, and I want to take you to that museum. Now, if I had to ask you, assuming you know a little bit about American basketball, probably more than I do anyway, but this detail I do know. What basketball team do you associate with bulls? That's right, Chicago. The Oriental Institute Museum of the University of Chicago, known locally as the U of C, holds a beautiful collection from the excavation at Persepolis. Let's jump in and see it. Look familiar? That, ladies and gentlemen, is a lot of bull. That is a colossal bullhead from the entrance to the Gate of All Nations built by Achashverosh. We're going to move up just so you can see it. See how high it is? And that was standing much, much higher. And so when you're standing in Persepolis, you have to envision this there. So I want you mentally to take this and to superimpose it over the gate that we're going to be seeing. Let's just point out some things that you're going to recognize here before we leave Chicago. Those bullheads, now we know what those are. They're the top of those pillars which were supporting the ceiling beams. There's an inscription back here with the name of Xerxes. And that guy over there, which is probably representing Xerxes himself, just like we saw in Tehran next to the throne, it's a Syrian-style royal building. So all of this is from Persepolis. And you can see also a panoramic view up here in a black and white image, which was taken almost 100 years ago when the expedition on behalf of the University of Chicago went to Persepolis and excavated. Well, how was visiting Chicago? Say goodbye, back to Persepolis. Now let's walk in and take a look at some of the palace. See that pillar still standing? Here's more striding lamassu, just like in ancient Assyria. Look how far you can see those pillars. Now just imagine the idea of Haman saying, I want this very, very high tree, 50 amah, 50 cubits high, to hang Mordechai on. It's something like this. I mean, these pillars obviously weren't standing like this at that time. They were actually supporting a ceiling, but you get the idea. You can sort of play with that idea. I'm just having fun. Okay, I'm going to jump to 2 more places here. Hold on tight because we're about to go into warp speed again. Whoa, that's a lot of sunshine. Let me put those on. That's a lot better. It's a beautiful sunset, which is captured apparently on July of 2020. In other words, this is fairly new. I'd like to show you a lot of people, and people who are coming from all over the place. Let's start with these guys. Oh, sorry. These are not people. These are a bull being attacked by a lion. Told you we're going to be seeing a lot of bulls. But look carefully at what remains of the railing of these stairs going up. It looks like stairs going up, and you can see legs of people and legs of animals. Now let's show you an inscription. Nah, later. We'll talk later about inscriptions. Now look, all of these 3 lines, you can call them registries. These 3 registries include images of many different people from all over the empire, all the different satrapies, all the different provinces, and they are bringing tribute to the king. I want you to see it up close. Okay. So look, here's a person with a bull. There's a person with a donkey below. There's a horse. There are some rams. And if we look a little bit back there, let me see. You'll see a Bactrian camel. You know, the camels with the 2 humps. And there are a lot of Persian guards who are either leading these people by the hand or escorting them from behind. Now, what's important about this is that the way you make or break an empire has to do with how you raise and collect taxes, because taxes are the blood of an empire. And in some cases, I mean, one of the reasons an empire wants to be an empire is because you can get really, really rich. And the Persian Empire, as we'll see, was the richest empire in the world. Well, definitely at the time. So, how did they sustain themselves? How did they keep going? They collected taxes very efficiently. And the builder of this palace, who was also the builder of the palace in Shushan, his name is Dariyavush, Darius, the father of Achashverosh, he was able to institute a kind of tax tribute bearing ceremony, procession, annual sort of pilgrimage to the capital where you bring it. Now, not that this is unusual in the ancient Near East, because you'd always have to bring your taxes, but he would make a big deal about it. And what you're seeing here is that while people would come in, imagine we're coming to the palace to bring tribute or taxes on behalf of our people, and we want to make sure that the king treats us well, and we have his audience, and he takes care of all of our internal affairs and defenses and all that stuff. So you're seeing these images, which were probably in full color, of everyone else doing the same thing. It really drives the point home. And this is called propaganda. And the Persian Empire, Darius the Great, was an expert at propaganda. We can talk about that in terms of what it is he wrote about himself. Kings in the ancient Near East always spoke about themselves highly, played up their successes, downplayed their failures. So this isn't unusual, but it's done on a larger scale and with this aspect which has to do with it being an international or cosmopolitan, multicultural empire. And that is what is new. That is something which is unique, and we're going to get back to that. We're going to go up the stairs, and as soon as we get to the top of the stairs, oh, look, more soldiers. As soon as we get to the top of the stairs, we're going to warp to another farther entrance on the other side of Persepolis. So 3, 2, 1. And we are in the Hall of 100 Columns. Why is it called the Hall of 100 Columns? You guessed right, because it has 100 columns. Look at all those column bases and lots of entrances. This was actually built by Xerxes, by Achashverosh. It's one of his additions to the palace. And I'd like to focus on this gate which he built on the other end. Let's move into that gate, shall we? We are now inside the gate. If you don't see it, it's because it's right behind us. Here we go. This person's bothering me. Can we move around? He's wearing a mask, by the way. If you caught that, that shows you how recent this picture was captured. It was captured in November of 2020. All right. From top to bottom, and then from bottom to top. There's the king sitting on his throne, just like we saw at the treasury from this very same place. We saw Xerxes Achashverosh sitting on his throne. So we don't need to see this in sharper image because we've already seen that, but we still will see it in our next stop. Now look at how he's sitting on a larger throne. So the small throne, sitting on larger throne. Now let's move from bottom to top. The lower registry, which is behind a glass pane, shows you about, how many people can you count? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people who have their hands raised up supporting the next register. And the next register, which appears to be somewhat fragmented, has more people holding another register, which is holding more people. And they are all underneath and supporting the throne. Remember, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a statue is worth 1,000,000. What is he telling us? Who is in control? And yet the throne itself is comprised of all of these many nations, all of these many people. It is a multicultural empire. And that is one of the secrets of the success of the Persian Empire. They were able to contain and manage all of these diverse nations with all of their differences and get them to work together in a way that worked, as opposed to the previous Babylonians and the Assyrians, who were always forcing everybody's hands in many different ways and forcing them to pay taxes. The Persians had a nice way about it. And in the words of Einstein, it's all relative. So we've seen Persepolis. We're about to exit Persepolis, and where we're going to be going from here in warp speed is to a museum which has about 8 million artifacts and lots of cool stuff that come directly from the excavations here at Persepolis and at Shushan in the Persian Empire. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the British Museum, the first national museum in the world. Let's get straight into the museum. So the British Museum is known for having amazing collections. It has the Rosetta Stone, it has some beautiful pieces of art, and it has treasures from the excavation in Iran, in Iraq, in Egypt, in Turkey, in Israel. So it's very, very relevant to Jewish history, which is why I bring it up a lot in my different tours. I want to take you straight to the location, which has what I think is the crown jewel of the Persian collection, and that is, of course, the Cyrus Cylinder. Before we see the Cyrus Cylinder, remember I promised you you're going to be seeing that same image from the gate of Xerxes, of the Hall of 100 Pillars. Here it is. Is it 100 pillars or 100 columns? Does it make a difference? I don't know. Here's the king sitting on his throne with the scepter in his hand and an attendant behind him who is too short to reach his head, but he's still trying, and kudos to him for trying. And I guess in this case you could stay for still being alive. I don't know what the standards were. Zooming out a little bit, here's the throne with all of the people bearing the throne, containing it, comprising it, holding it up. This is what the empire consists of. And the images on both sides, also copies from Persepolis, show you the king battling a lion. Want to take an extra second, extra peek? Here you go. Here's the king battling a lion. And now that we've seen that, we have satisfied our thirst for everything outside. Let's go inside to the Cyrus Cylinder. You see it there? 3, 2, 1. The Cyrus Cylinder. The Cyrus Cylinder is where I'm going to take just a moment to digress and to give you a tiny little bit of the historical background of the story of Purim. The Cyrus Cylinder has been called before the first charter of human rights. Now, we can challenge this notion, but I want to just explain what that means. The Cyrus Cylinder is very similar to the closing words of Tanakh, the closing words of Chronicles, and the opening words of Ezra, the book of Ezra, where it says that in the first year, the year of the ascension of Cyrus the Great, he said that the God of Israel has commanded him to allow his people, the Jewish people, to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, and it will be done under the auspices of the empire. Now, this is something which seemed really outlandish and maybe even arrogant when Bible scholars approached the subject before this was discovered, because it's like, what are you talking about? This couldn't have possibly happened. This is all fantasy. And then this cylinder was found in Babylon, which was captured by Cyrus the Great, without a battle, by the way. And it tells the story of how he is commanded by all the gods and so on to help the Babylonians rebuild their temples, which were destroyed by the previous emperor, Nabonidus, and it's going to be done under the auspices of the empire. So now let's think about how that fits our story. It's not about the Jews, but it tells us about a general policy that the Persians had, which made them favorable. And when I said that the notion of this being the first charter of human rights is somewhat contested, it's because Cyrus isn't the only person to have done this before. But Cyrus did it on a very, very large scale, and it also impacted us. Now, briefly going over the history so that we know where we are located in the story. Cyrus the Great marches into Babylon, captures the king of Babylon, which he writes about here in the Cylinder, and establishes the Persian Empire. Now, his son Cambyses doesn't last too long and is succeeded by Darius the Great, who usurped the throne. Darius is the king who built the palace in Shushan and the palace in Persepolis. And it's the son of Darius, Cheshayarsha, Xerxes, Achashverosh, who is the hero or anti-hero or villain, whatever you want to call him, of our story. He's the king who opens up the story, who marries Esther, who sends out the edicts to at first destroy and then save the Jews. That's our story. After the story of Purim is Ezra and Nehemiah, who then go and resume the building of the Second Temple, which began but was left on hold. So that's the overall story. Now, our story begins with a great party, and the party took place in the palace in Shushan, and I want to show you things from the party. First things first, I'm going to show you the soldier here. Let's move in. So first things first, who were the people who came to the party? Who were the attendants? The story says that it was Chel Paras Umadai. There was the army of the Persians and the Medes, who really we know worked together at the time. And people from all over the empire, all of these apartemim and the ministers of the different nations, the different provinces. So you see images of these all here from Shushan, colorful glazed bricks, just like we saw in Tehran. Now let's talk about gold and silver. I hope you didn't get too dizzy. Gold and silver. First of all, gold. The Persian Empire was the wealthiest empire the world had ever seen. The wealthiest. They had so much gold and silver. You can just imagine all the people of royal stature standing there with all of these bracelets and pendants and hair and jewelry, wearing all of this stuff. You can see that there are these bracelets that end with an animal shape. They call that zoomorphic, funky word. There's rings up here on the top, rings such as Achashverosh will be wearing his signet ring in order to sign documents. So we have a lot of those rings. There's hairpins, pendants, little decorative shapes of animals. I think that's a dog and a bird, a pigeon. Anyway, it's really cool. You're seeing a lot of this neat stuff made out of gold and silver. Now, the bowls. These silver bowls were used for drinking wine while you're reclining. So you have the wine pour into the bowl and you drink out of the bowl. This was also found by the Greeks. Cool. And there are lots of deep bowls and cups called rhytons. And I'm going to show you some close-ups of these. But I want you to just appreciate the luxury. So what they say about the Persian Empire is that they had so much gold and silver that they never used the same dishes twice. Whether or not this is true, it may as well would have been, because it really is how much gold and silver that they had. I mean, imagine you're coming as a dignitary representing your country to the massive feast that is being made and hosted by Achashverosh in Shushan, 180 days in that Apadhana Palace and the banquet hall that we saw, right? And the gardens, it's all happening there in Shushan. And there's these lavish gold and silver dishes, and you get to keep one and take one home. Who knows? Maybe that's, if they didn't wash it, they didn't use it twice. I mean, it's very possible, right? So you get to keep those things. Now, look at these images. So one of these images shows you a rhyton again, a rhyton made of gold terminating in the form of a lion, and next to it some kind of ibex, and these are found in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The next one here is one of these bowls known as a fiali, right here from the British Museum. And next to it are some of these golden bracelets, which, who knows, worn by royal women. Probably not Queen Esther herself, but it's not far from it. This is the kind of jewelry you'd see. And finally, there's this image here of lots of dishes, all these dishes that we're seeing all gathered in one location for a photograph. And this is, of course, here in the British Museum. And to give you a sense, I want to read you a quote from Herodotus, who talks about the encampment of Xerxes as he travels. He's talking about the lavishness of his banquet, his feast, as he's traveling. And I quote, "Treasure there was in plenty, tents full of gold and silver furniture, couches overlaid with the same precious metals, bowls, goblets, and cups all made of gold, and wagons loaded with sacks of gold and silver basins. It is said that Xerxes, on his retreat from Greece, left his tent with Mardonius." It's a person. "When Pausanias saw it, with its embroidered hanging and gorgeous decorations in silver and gold, he summoned Mardonius's bakers and cooks and told them to prepare a meal of the same sort that they were accustomed to prepare for their former master. The order was obeyed, and when Pausanias saw gold and silver couches, all beautifully draped, and gold and silver tables, and everything prepared for the feast with great magnificence, he could hardly believe his eyes for the good things set before him." Now, if this was the traveling banquet, imagine what it was like in the palace, reflecting those words at the opening of the story about beds plated with gold and silver and alabaster floors and all kinds of fabrics hanging from the curtains, and beautifully, beautifully described. So that's the story of the feast. And if Achashverosh wanted to make a feast that people are going to be talking about for years, guys, learn from this, because we're still talking about it. Our next stop. Now, we have 3 more topics to talk about in this tour. The first one has to do with inscriptions and with language. This inscription below is an inscription which has the name Xerxes on it. And I'd like to pause there for just a moment and tell you the story of how we know that Xerxes is Achashverosh. And of course, I'm going to be making this short and to the point. So there was a very famous British scholar who studied these inscriptions. We're talking about almost 200 years ago. He was a British soldier in the Indian Army, and he was stationed there in Iran. And he found these inscriptions, and there was some earlier work done in these inscriptions before. And so one of these inscriptions found in Hamadan reads, and I'm showing you the image right now on the screen, reads on the top, Chishayarsha. Chishayarsha, and on the bottom you see there's an underline as well, Dariyavush. Dariyavush. Chishayarsha is Chirchish, Chishayarsh, and that is how the Greeks got to Chirchish, which is the Greek writing, which in English we mispronounce Xerxes. So Chishayarsh is Chishayarsha, and in Hebrew, because it's really hard to pronounce this very heavily consonantal sound, we add an ah. So it's, instead of being Chshayarsha, it's Achashverosh. And if it's Achashverosh, Achashverosh, it's not so far away from there. And so we have at least the pronunciation. When it comes to Dariyavush, Darius, Dariyavush, that's a lot easier. So that's a bit of an introduction to how the name was found. But now I want to take you to another exotic site in the Persian Empire. And this treasure that I'm about to show you is as important to us as the Rosetta Stone. Hold on to your seatbelts. We're about to jump to Behistun. Too much sunlight. Can't take it. Okay, that's much better. Let's move around. All right. So from right to left, there's one tomb which is carved into the face of the stone, and it's in the dark. And now I got to take my sunglasses off. It's a little hard to see because it's really in the dark, but that is the tomb of Xerxes right over here. Okay? And then we have the tomb of Darius the Great, and there's two other ones. What's important to us is what's carved into the face of the tomb of Darius the Great. So let's move up close. I'm about to zoom into this picture, sharing a slide, but before I do that, I want you to try to identify what we're seeing. You see that there's a dais here, like a large, it looks like a bed, but it's a dais, and it has two registers of people holding it up, just like we saw in Persepolis with the people holding up the throne. So this is the same visual language which Darius used and his successors used. And because the picture I'm showing you is not going to show you the dais, it was important for me to show this to you. But now look at the picture. This picture shows you Darius on the left, standing tall, trampling his enemy, and before him are his enemies captured, handcuffed, and chained by the neck, and above them is the image of the Zoroastrian god, Ahura Mazda, and there are lots of boxes of text around him. And the text is what I would like to focus on. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this inscription, known as the Behistun inscription, is the Rosetta Stone of cuneiform. The Rosetta Stone, which was found in Egypt, helped us decipher the code of hieroglyphics because it had another script on it, which is Egyptian, and it also had ancient Greek. And because we knew how to read ancient Greek, the work was done. And long story short, we are able to read hieroglyphics today. The Behistun inscription, thanks to Darius the Great and thanks to the Persians writing in many languages, and was written in 3 different languages. It was written in Babylonian, in Elamite, and in Old Persian. And because it is written in 3 different languages, we can compare and contrast these languages and crack the code for reading cuneiform. They were all written in this wedge-shaped letters, cuneiform, one of the most ancient texts. And it's thanks to this comparison, which was done by Rawlinson, and again, making a very long story short, that we are able to read the writings of the Persian Empire, of the Babylonians, of the Assyrians, and all of these incredible archives that have survived history, even though the Persians' archives did not survive. But we're able to read them thanks to this. Now, how is that important to our story? Remember that throughout the Megillah, throughout the story, we have these edicts which are issued from the king, and they are written in many different languages. Medina u Medina kichtava, ve'am va'am kilshono. It sounds a little bit silly. Like, what is this royal edict telling people that anyone can speak whatever language he wants in his home? I mean, come on, right? But the Persian Empire had to keep everybody together and keep them happy. Remember, it's a multicultural empire. So if you want to make things easy for people, think of how people are going to complain under Assyria and Babylon when they have to pay their taxes and fill out all their tax returns in a foreign language and pay a translator, and they're being forced to pay these exorbitant taxes, and you're not making it any easy for me. Come along the Persians, and they say, we will make it easy for you. We will speak your language. A gente vamos falar sua língua. And in your language, it's making it a lot easier for you. So if you want to manage this massive empire, you have to have many languages. And here's where I want to show you something really, really awesome from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I want to thank Rabbi Yehuda Landi for pointing this out to me. This alabaster jar, which looks very Egyptian, and it was indeed from Egypt, reads on it 3 different lines of text in cuneiform, 3 different languages: Babylonian, Elamite, and Old Persian, and 1 more hieroglyphic language. And all of these 4 languages say Xerxes, the great king. This is the king of our story who also dominated Egypt, as the story tells us. And this is from Egypt, and we have his name in hieroglyphics as well. Isn't that incredible? So this point that I'd like to make is that when you want to run such a powerful empire, one of the secrets for the Persians' success is their ability to communicate with people in different languages and making it easier for them. That was the point about having many languages. And now we have 2 more points. Let's go back to the British Museum. The next point I want to talk about, a very, very short point, has to do with taxes. So look here below. Here's some images of silver bits, silver pieces. And I'm going to show you in just a moment an image from the Israel Museum, which shows you from an earlier period how the silver was weighed. So here's an image from the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, which shows you a scale. And below it, you see that there's jars that were broken, and they were full of bits of silver known as hack silver. And you can see right here a system of weights of the shekel system, which is an Egyptian measurement system. And you can understand now that when you want a certain weight, you put the stone on one end of the scale and the silver on the other, and you weigh it. Now, what's the Hebrew word for weight? It's mishkal. What is the Hebrew word for silver? It's kesef. Money is also kesef. How did silver and money become interchangeable in Hebrew? Because it used to be that you would weigh silver, and a shekel weight unit, shekel, which means weight, a weight measurement, a weight unit of silver was called shekel kesef. So this is just an example, because now I'm going to show you the next weight up, the next measurement up, which is not a shekel, but a kikal. And that is this lion weight over here. Let's get a better look at him. Here is a little lion weight that was actually found in Turkey from this period of time, and it weighs about 31 kilograms. Now, that weight of 1 talent is called in Hebrew a kikar. Kikar, which was weighing silver, is a kikar kesef. A kikar measurement of silver is called kikar kesef. Now, where does that show up in the Megillah? We have our villain, our true villain of the story, Haman, coming to try to bribe the king, I guess, or to very strongly convince him, make him an offer he can't refuse, offering him 10,000 kikar kesef, 10,000 kikar kesef. Now, we know that a kikar kesef is 30 kilograms, and so you're talking about 30 tons of silver. According to Herodotus, that amount of silver is almost the annual revenue, the annual tax collection of the Persian Empire. That should knock your socks off. How does Haman have that kind of money? Putting that question aside right now, we know throughout the Megillah that the king is struggling with taxes. We see that he constantly is lowering taxes to try to gain the popularity of the people. So, for example, Esther is coronated. He's giving everybody tax breaks, right? And he keeps on doing this. At the end of the story, we have a very strange closing of the story, which doesn't really sound so climactic, which tells us that the king Achashverosh was able to impose taxes on the Greek islands, on the islands of the sea. Sounds so anecdotal, but that is the point. Remember that what makes or breaks an empire is their ability to raise and collect taxes. And as we mentioned, as we alluded to earlier, the king Xerxes was involved in a failed campaign against the Greeks. He finally succeeds in imposing taxes on the Greeks and I guess regaining what he lost. So the point that I was making here is that the Persian Empire is really involved and preoccupied with collecting taxes, and we see that throughout our story. Now let's go back to Haman. We have a king who is struggling with taxes, and then comes in this hero of the day and says to the king, you know what? I'll take care of your annual taxes. All I need you to do is to sign this executive order. And what is the king's response? Here's my ring. Sign whatever you want. No questions asked. Ever wondered why Achashverosh responds like that? Well, it's quite simple. Haman made him an offer he can't refuse. He just secured him an entire annual income. And so if that's the case, you can understand why the king is happy to let him sign whatever he wants with his ring, no questions asked. That is an incredible story. Now, we have one last stop, one last station here, and for that, I have a little bit of a surprise for you. So I want to talk about horses. How many horses can you count in this relief? Looks like 3. On top of it are these decorated harnesses for the horses. So, it looked nice. Horses in the story of Purim are actually more important than you'd think, because every time an edict is issued from the empire, from the kingdom, we hear that the horse riders were sent out on the double really, really quickly, and they have to go all over the place. And it just sounds like such a whole to-do about the horses going out. It's like something out of Gilbert and Sullivan. They're just running out there. It really sounds over the top. Here is where history reveals to us an incredible thing. So before I reveal what that point is, I want to show you a surprise. Do you recognize where we are? We are in New York City. We are looking at Penn Station, at Madison Square Garden, and at the United States Postal Service, the James Farley Building. And this is where I want to take us. Hold on, we are jumping in. So this building, the U.S. Post Office, look at that beautiful building. And there's a quote on top of the pillars. And I'd like to read that quote with you. And then we're going to ask the question of what is this quote? So it says as follows: neither snow nor rain, nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. For many years, people assumed that quote is basically the motto of the United States Postal Service. But that's not what it is. It's actually a quote from Herodotus. Look at this. Here's the picture of the building. It looks quite different without all the yellow taxes around it. And here is a version of the text. And it says as follows: nothing mortal travels as fast as the Persian messengers. The entire plan is a Persian invention. Nothing stops these couriers from accomplishing at their best speed the distance which they have to go, neither snow, rain, heat, nor darkness of night. This is from Herodotus' The Histories, Book 8, Chapter 98. We are seeing on the main building of the United States Postal Service a quote from Herodotus describing the messengers of Achashverosh, of Xerxes. Isn't that incredible? And what exactly is he talking about? I promised we were going to get back to our car that we parked in Tehran. Well, here we are. Our car is still here, and we're looking at the map of the Persian Empire. I want to pay close attention to this red line, which spans from the center, from the epicenter of the empire, from the palace in Shushan, all the way to western Turkey, to the city of Sardis, the road from Susa to Sardis. In that quote, which I just abbreviated, which is quoted in the United States Postal Service building, the James Farley building in New York, is talking about the road from Susa to Sardis. This is the road, and this is what the Persians invented. The fastest messenger system in the world. The fastest messenger system the world has ever seen. They have managed to shrink the distance to create a sort of global village of 2,500 years ago, in which you can really, with almost fast speed internet, so to speak, communicate around the empire. This distance used to take months to travel by horse, and the Persians were able to shrink that time to 1 week. How do you do it in 1 week? Herodotus describes that there were about 111 stations along the way with fresh, trained, high-speed horses waiting and messengers waiting. And so you run to one station, let your horses rest, change your horses, change the messenger, and the message keeps on going. It doesn't stop. Neither rain, no snow, no gloom of night. Nothing is going to stop these messengers. They managed to shrink the distance and to cover that distance in 1 week. And if that's from the epicenter of the empire, you can now understand that in order to communicate with the whole empire, it took 1 week in each direction. That is something the world has never seen. And that is what is going on in the Megillah, because if you want to control such a massive territory, you have to be able to communicate with it. You have to keep it in check. You have to issue royal decrees. You have to collect taxes. You have to know what's going on. It's all about intelligence, communication. And this is what the Persian Empire was able to do, which no one else was successful in doing. One of several things we have seen which have transformed the Persian Empire into the most powerful empire in the history of the ancient Near East. That is the story, ladies and gentlemen. That is the virtual tour for Purim in the days of Achashverosh. We've basically seen how reviewing the locations and the artifacts in the museum, looking at the map, looking at the geography, looking at the artifacts, has transformed the way we both appreciate the Persian Empire and understand the story of Purim and see how it comes to life. How the story of Purim really has, between the lines, such a wealth of information, which combined with the history and the archaeology and the geography, really brings the story to life. I hope you enjoyed that. I encourage you to keep on following and look out for the next tours that are coming up. We have A Winter's Tale and the Pesach Tour and my monthly mystery tour. And I'm also growing a community on Facebook called Museums Fun and Learning. There's the YouTube channel and all the other social media links that you can see here, linked here in the information. I hope to see you again. Thank you so much for watching and have a happy Purim.